Thank you for joining. I am super excited for today's session and appreciate everyone being here during Workforce Development Month. And again, I'm excited to be able to share this work and appreciate Tanisha being with, or Dr. Pruitt, I should say, being with us here today. You are joining the monthly webinar from the Ohio Workforce Coalition, and these webinars are offered and recorded. They're offered monthly and put on our website at ohioworkforcecoalition.org. You can check out the website and learn more about the current policy priorities, as well as our leadership members and so on. There's also a bunch of resources that have been updated there recently that you can access. Since 2007, the coalition has been bringing together leaders from across the workforce development ecosystem to really focus on systems and policies and practices that can grow prosperity across Ohio through policy change and policy supports. We support efforts to advance the interests of workers, the quality of jobs, and the transparency and equity of our workforce systems. Today is a webinar format. If you would like to ask questions or make a comment, you can do so. The chat should be enabled. If the chat is not working, you can either reach out to me or, well, we'll keep an eye on it and make sure that it is working, so you don't have to worry about that. We had a little glitch last month. Finally, we would appreciate it if you could consider, this is our 15th year, investing in the coalition. Any sort of support is greatly appreciated so that we can continue to bring you webinars and our newsletter and move the policy priorities forward. And you can also follow us on Twitter, Ohio WFC, and that's the first place that we really get into our recommendations, events that are happening, and so on. So I'm going to move to today's speaker. So today's speaker is Dr. Tanisha Pruitt, and she is going to be talking to us about a report that Policy Matters Ohio has been releasing, gosh, I don't know how many years at this point, but for many years, the State of Working Ohio. Tanisha has been a member of the Ohio Workforce Coalition Leadership Committee and has really been digging into the workforce policy issues that at Policy Matters. So we will post a link to her bio in our chat, but want to save as much time as possible and just go ahead and turn it over to Tanisha.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Tanisha Pruitt. I'm a State Policy Fellow with Policy Matters Ohio. And as Rebecca said, I will be reporting on, I did not actually write on this report, but I wanted to come and share some highlights that sort of came from our report. Again, I'm with Policy Matters Ohio. There are our information, Facebook, Twitter, and signing up for our e-news if you're interested. So since the pandemic, Ohioans have been able to get back to work and work towards a working economy for everyone. Historic levels of federal spending to families, businesses, and state and local government has helped drive a rapid but partial jobs recovery from the COVID recession. So by July 2022, Ohio had recovered about 85% of jobs lost to COVID-19. But even with jobs being destroyed during the pandemic, the number and share of Ohioans working or seeking has approached pre-COVID levels. And although disparities continue to persist since during COVID-19, working people have overall won pay increases across the income scale for the first time. However, high inflation now threatens to wipe out those gains for many. Across the nation, we are feeling the impact of inflation, rising gas prices, rising food prices, and an increase on rental prices are deeply impacting our economy. COVID-19 triggered inflation by causing supply chain bottlenecks and new consumer buying patterns. Also, Russia's war on Ukraine has made it even worse. Inflation reached 9.1% in June of 2022, a 40-year high before dipping to 8.7% by July. Rapid price growth is making it more difficult for the Ohioans who are already struggling to cover the basics. Corporate profiteering is keeping US inflation rates above what they would be if corporations were not taking a historic share of price growth as profits. So what we are seeing here is that firms and businesses are doing what they're doing with the money that is coming in from increased prices. So this is how businesses, as shows, are driving inflation. The different colors that you see, the blue and the green, are current and prior recessions. So you see the blue is the 1979 to 2019 average, and the green is 2020 to the second quarter of 2021. I'm sorry, the second quarter of 2020 to the fourth quarter of 2021. So what we see is that businesses are spending more on labor, but 53% of increased costs are being hoarded as just profits. So even as labor costs and wages act as a drag on inflation and the supply chain issues are easing, which we can see in the non-labor cost, the middle row, inflation is still persistent because the problem is in corporate profits driving prices, as we can see from the bottom. That's where the 53% comes in. So corporations are taking advantage of inflation by boosting profits over input costs. And the federal response to raise interest rates do not really attack this problem, but what we need is more of a corporate excess profits tax. So this would enable firms to cover their own increased costs, but discourage price gouging. This policy would also have an added benefit of directing the cost of inflation reduction to the corporate actors that are now driving it. High inflation is not good, and it makes it hard for low and middle income people to meet their basic needs. Corporations came out of COVID-19 with record high profits, only to raise prices because the inflation started by COVID-19 gave them the cover to be able to do that. Next slide, please. So as you can see from this slide, it is just showing that recessions in general hit Ohio harder, and we barely recover compared to the nation. So as you can see, following the trend from 1990, as we go through, and then you sort of hit the recession of 2008, Ohioans are, have gone down. They have never been able to quite catch up since then, as much as the rest of the nation has been able to. So recessions, what we are seeing, they are far more destructive for far much longer than Ohio, and we're not recovering at the same rates. So next, we're going to talk about some labor force participation trends that we have seen. So as you can see here, since March of 2020, quits were slightly elevated, but not by that much. So the blue line in the middle is the average number of quits. And then you can see how they have, fluctuated since December. And the gray bars in the middle, those are the times during recession. So you can see where our quits lie during times of recession. And you can see that their, quits are rising, but not by that much.
Tanisha, I think we are getting perhaps notification of your messages. I can imagine you get a lot of emails. I think we're getting dinged when something pops up. Are you able to disable that?
I can try. I just muted it, so maybe that will help.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry. Let me know if you hear it again.
Thank you, thank you.
But so this chart shows that shows the number of quits compared to the numbers of hires. And so what you can see is that the numbers of Ohioans that have been hired is exceeding the number of those that quit every month on record. our US and Ohio labor force participation is far from the 2008 recession levels. As you can see, in the United States, the labor force participation has been going down, same within Ohio. And Ohio's is going down, slightly more than the rest of the nation. When we look at labor force participation between men and women, we see that women are increasing their participation in the workforce. Their gap between the two are shrinking, but we still see that women represented by the green line are still represented lower in the labor force participation. So here you can see labor force participation broken down by both race and gender. And what we are seeing here is that Black men are contributing less into the workforce, but you also see the labor force participation rates going down for white men, which is the top line, that we have been seeing that decline over the last few years. And what we see is that Black women, by the yellow line, their workforce participation is actually increasing, and it's actually increasing above that of white women's. It's very slightly, but it is going up in recent years. So with the unemployment, when we consider unemployment, you can see that well, in Ohio, we have a decreasing amount of unemployment overall, but as you can see, not all Ohioans are experiencing the job market in the same way. So between, this is looking at the rates between 1979 and 2021, and you can see now that Black Ohioans are over twice as likely as white workers to be unemployed. So this chart here just represents how Ohio between 2000 and 2021, the percent change in jobs. And so as you can see, Ohio is the green lines. And as you can see, we are pretty much staying underneath the line in terms of job growth compared to the rest of the nation. And going down even now in 2020, 2021, you can see that, the rest of the nation is above the line. They're kind of an upward trend in terms of job growth, whereas Ohio is sort of going down. We're seeing a decline.
So Tanisha, I'm sorry, Dr. Pruitt, we have a question in the chat that I think might be worth.
And it's also for this same slide, I'm sorry, it's also important to note that, we can't afford to continue to lose jobs to stem inflation, which is some of the current policies that are going on, because Ohio, we still need around 124,000 jobs to recover our pre-COVID number from February 2020. So we've recovered, as I said earlier, about 85% of jobs, which is great. And it happened quickly, but we're not where we need to be yet.
Thank you. So the question that, can you hear me okay? The question we have in the chat is, can you explain the decline in males in the workforce? And I thought it might be helpful to also, if you could share.
Next slide, please.
I think she can't hear us because she
Tanisha, can you hear?
Announcement.
Rebecca?
No, she can't. Go ahead and just go to the next slide.
Thank you. So as you can see here is a representation of Ohio's key job industries. And you can see that for 2021, trade, transportation, and utilities was our biggest employer, with education and health services coming in second. And here are changes in our job mix, before and during the COVID-19 pandemic. And as you can see here, if you look at the second from the last under trade, transportation, and utility, trade is the only industry to see growth during the pandemic in Ohio. So that's represented by the small green line that's, a little above that, the 3.6%. You can see that that's the only industry that went up.
I'm guessing that Carter shared the chat. Tanisha,
sorry,
can you
I'm
hear
trying to
us?
answer the question. Can you explain the decline in males in the workforce? Yes, so for what was explained to me by Michael, who was the reporter, the researcher for this report, and he can always answer questions that I may not be able to answer to, but he was attributing, much of the decline to sort of trends starting from deindustrialization to increased, participation in the criminal justice system, to just structural barriers in access to jobs and wages in general. So those are some of the factors that in the report Michael was highlighting as towards the decline in workforce participation for men. Next slide, please. So what this slide shows us is the wage growth and productivity. So what we can see here is that, in the US, net productivity and wage growth pretty much went hand in hand until they began to split off shortly after 1969. And ever since then, wages have never really been able to catch up to net productivity. So as we can see here, being productive is not always a good indicator of pay, and wage growth is not just about being good at your job. It's also contingent upon power, and that power can come from having a union on the job, good pro-worker policies, and a robust federal minimum wage. And this is just looking at the percent change in Ohio's GDP compared to median wages. You can just see that as GDP increases, wages are not necessarily increasing at the same rate. Ohio continues to fall behind the US with both below pre-COVID wage levels. So as you can see here, wages were higher across the board for Ohioans by 2021 than they had previously been in 1979. But for some workers, that wasn't true until COVID-19 due to the robust federal aid. And so you can see that there, has been wage increases, but it still is just not on par with the rest of the nation. And you can see here wages broken down by income percentile. So what we see here is that those earners in the top 90th percentile, they are also being paid more, while those, in the 10th percentile and middle 50th percentile, they tend to be making less. When we look at the gender wage gap, we see that it was shrinking, leading up until 2020. And then, due to the pandemic, those numbers the gap has started to slightly widen again. When we look at the difference between Black and white Ohioans, the difference has nearly tripled. When you look at the trends between 1979 and 2021. So you can see that, Black workers, they are now making around $16.92 compared to white workers making around $21.26. So this shows that pay increases for women, pay has been increasing for women, but has been being pushed down, particularly for Black men. So for this report, this is the first time that we have disaggregated data for both for both race and gender at the same time. And what we found was one of the biggest findings of this report this year, which was that while Black women actually had some pay growth over the last 4 decades, Black men have seen their wages collapse. So their wages have gone down 91 cents on the dollar compared to their white male counterparts to just 74 cents now. So that's a loss of nearly $5 an hour over this entire time frame. And we know that Black men have experienced all of the wage losses, since after the Civil Rights Act. Policymakers have stripped away worker protections, and that racism has been harmful to everyone, but especially Black men. And this is affecting, their wages and their ability to earn. And then you see that Black women, I don't know if you remember from earlier, Black women are participating in the labor force more than white women, but what we can see here is that they are still paid less. Workers with college degrees are paid nearly twice as much as high school graduates that we can see here. So you can see that at the top line, those with a bachelor's or higher are earning considerably more compared to those with just some college, high school, and then less than high school. So one thing that this kind of shows and that we know is that unions matter. And we can see here that the wage premium belonging to a union is nearly $5 more an hour compared to those non-union members. And when you look at it across different backgrounds, you can see, how those that are union represented across different groups, even for Black workers, even for women, they still earn more compared to those that are non-union represented. And here are some trends that we found between education and wages. So here is that, Ohioans were more educated than ever. Those with a high school or more are earning about, are about 90.8% compared to in past years. And those with a bachelor's or more is about 28.9%, which is higher than, years prior. And then when we look at the racial wage gap that persists across every education level. So you see that, Black workers compared to white workers at every single level of education still earn less, even in the advanced levels. And when you look at it between men and women, you see that, women across every level, even at the advanced, graduate school levels, they are still earning less. And having a college education, what we see is really helping people hold on to jobs. And so as you can see from the yellow line, unemployment is very, very low for those with a bachelor's or higher at about 2.6% in 2021, which is just a slight increase, from 2.1% in 1979. So in conclusion, we owe much of our recovery, which has moved 3 times as fast as recovery from the Great Recession, to the historic funding from the federal government. More than 4 in 5 jobs have been restored. Workers have begun to have success in bargaining for higher wages. And today, inflation caused by COVID-19 and Russia's war on Ukraine has become the immediate policy challenge. Given Ohio's weak and often partial recovery from recent recessions and how aggressive inflation policy decimated Ohio manufacturing jobs in the past, all Ohioans have a stake in making sure policymakers choose targeted tools that limit job destruction and direct the cost of inflation reduction to the corporations profiting from it so that we all can thrive. Here's some contact information for us. If you would like to read, this was just highlights in the report. There's a lot more detail into the reports to kind of explain more some of those trends. And so if you would like access to that, I included the link there. And I can be, there's my email if you have any questions for me. If you want to email Mike, the report researcher. I've included his email, and you can also sign up for our newsletter.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate you sharing. It's always hard to share out on someone, on a report you haven't written. Thank you. So I appreciate you doing so. And we will include the link to the full report in the follow-up for today's meeting, but we have lots of time for question and answer and discussion. And as Dr. Pruitt noted, if she can't answer something, or someone else on the call can't answer, we certainly can follow up with Mr. Shields and get a response back. So there are a couple questions. I think that the first question that you read in the chat was about the decline of men in the workforce. I also was wondering if you could just start off and give us some basic definitions. So as we think about labor force participation, what exactly does that mean? Just in case there's anyone on here who's not totally equipped with how we define labor force participation. You are muted.
Hello. Okay. From what I understand, from how it's looked at, especially in this report, is just those that are entering the workforce. So those that are employed in some way, shape, or form. That is what we consider to be labor force participation.
Okay. And I think from a standard, well, we should talk about it, but my understanding is it's anyone who's working or looking for work. And so it could include folks who have been unemployed for a while, or new graduates. Does that sound right? Okay. Okay. And then where do individuals who have been kind of the long-term unemployed, where do they fit? Or people who maybe weren't going back because of COVID, or like, how does that all play in?
That I am not 100% sure.
Okay. Okay.
But I can ask Mike.
Okay. For sure. For sure. So there's another question here about what role immigrants play in the economy and how they show up in the data.
I'm sorry. That question, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that's answered in a SOWO. I have not read the entire thing, but I can definitely get that question answered for you.
And Gina, if you want to add into the chat, a little bit more detail. I think when it comes to immigrant and refugee workforce, there's a lot of different things to consider, undocumented versus documented, and various implications of both of those would certainly be important, and what we know. And there's also leadership committee member who is working a lot on immigrant issues. And so if you'd like more information there, we can make some connections.
Yes.
So as please feel free to put your questions in the chat. You can also raise your hand if you would prefer to talk. That's fine as well. I am interested. So as we look at the state of working Ohio, and we think about what workers are facing, there's a lot of conversations about not just profits, but the quality of jobs and what employers can do relative to the quality of those jobs. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on, it certainly makes sense to look at wages, but all of the other factors that individuals are facing when we talk about work.
Yeah, so the access to jobs, it's like our education, the skills, are we building a skilled labor force? So that's where like apprenticeship programs and increasing investment in those sort of programs are coming into play to provide those sort of alternative pathways to work, connect unions. Unions are becoming bigger and bigger. So it's more important that we continue collective bargaining, and we continue to be able to use unions as a vehicle to connect people, right, to quality jobs, and connect people, especially those that are, marginalized or traditionally, disadvantaged when it comes to the workforce. So I think that, those are some different ways in which I know we're looking into at Policy Matters of, connecting people to the workforce, and just ways that, work and, connecting people to quality jobs and to the workforce in general.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We've got some chat happening in the chat. Thank you. Talking about how do we translate between labor force participation, unemployment rates, and really these different indicators. And that's kind of what I think that was Gina again. That's kind of what I was getting at with the point about how do we define these various measures, because I'm also a non-economics person and trying to make sense of what's what. I think even some common definitions are super helpful. And I think certainly being able to communicate it to policymakers is important for sure. Let's see. So, Christina weighed in. People who are out of the workforce due to COVID, long COVID, kind of what I was getting at, they depress the labor force participation rate. And, that continues to be an important consideration, particularly as we look at racial disparities in labor force participation and the unemployment rate. I mean, it's been really interesting to me as we start talking about, there's such a demand, there's labor, so much demand for workers, and unemployment's low, but asking for whom, and who is continuing to see persistently high unemployment. So thank you for that. Other questions? Let's see, we got a new message. A definition sheet. Yep. Yeah. I think it would be helpful. I don't know anyone who can retire at 65 anymore. I think that's been another interesting thing going on. Certainly since the Great Recession.
And Mike, I know, is planning. He's going to be having different bites of this overall report coming out. So the question about male, participation decreasing, and then Black male wages going down, he's going to create smaller briefs that go into more details about those sort of things. So just be on the lookout for, later work. He's also going to get into more of the inflationary piece, since that's sort of a pressing issue right now. So there will be a lot more, things coming out about this stuff.
So I'm wondering if anyone who's either in the audience or you, Dr. Pruitt, as you think about the state of working Ohio, what role does employer data play in how you're analyzing? So you shared some numbers about inflation, you shared kind of the overall some profit numbers. As you think about and look at policy solutions, does other data from an employer perspective play into it?
That I'm not sure. I would imagine though that it should, more, I think the more detailed data we can get, the more disaggregated data that we can get, we can paint better pictures. I think, to be able to get as specific as possible. I'm not sure, we can start looking at county level data, different things like that sort of really get down to the areas where people are suffering, where unemployment is high and where wages are low, and how we can really, approach those issues in those areas and come up with policy solutions to fix them.
Absolutely. And one of the big policy conversations happening that we didn't necessarily talk about here, but I think is critically important is the benefit cliff and the frontline low wage workers across Ohio who are impacted by reductions in, hitting that cliff. And again, in the interest of defining things, the benefit cliff is when you get an incremental increase in wages that then make you ineligible for public benefits that are of higher value than the increase in wages that you received. And it's been a long time since I looked at this data, but it used to be that something like 70% of the Ohioans who were under 200% of poverty were actually working. people are going to work, they're piecing together multiple part-time jobs, or they're working within the gig economy, or, you know, they're working and still poor. And so as we think about what policy recommendations we want to make about supporting people so that they can advance and earn more money, and what that means to the employer community, I think that those benefit cliff conversations are super, super important.
Yes.
All right, other questions? Let's see, it looks like we've got some clarifications up, numerators and denominators. I'm gonna have to refresh. Let's see, so see the chat. Christina Scott offered some clarifications around what makes up some of these numbers. And I think, like Gina said, maybe a definition sheet. We could compile something and get it on the coalition website. And, you know, is critically important to take a look at this report, read the report. There's also going to be a report coming out that is a partnership from the coalition and Advocates for Ohio's Future and Business Leaders United that looks at the benefit cliff and where are people who are facing the cliff working, what sectors, what can we learn from them? And we'll look forward to sharing more about that in the near future. Tanisha, any parting thoughts? Or I'm sorry, I'm being so disrespectful. Dr. Pruitt, gosh, that you deserve to be called. Awarded the title. You earned it. So any parting thoughts, any additional details you want to share with us, or words of encouragement as folks are pounding the pavement to advocate for workers?
Yeah, I would just say, you know, just keep going, keep, you know, fighting for unions, keep, you know, enforcing unions. We know that they matter. That's what we're really working on at Policy Matters, where, you know, I encourage everyone to dive into the SOWO because, like I said, it's huge. This was only a small chunk of there's more, you know, to cover, which I'm sure would have, you know, answered probably more of your questions. And so I would encourage you to just, you know, read into it, look into it, and see kind of where our policy priorities align with how we approach work and how we approach, you know, being able to close the wage gaps that still persist. Like we keep saying, you know, we've been able to recover 85% of jobs, but there's still so many jobs missing. So we need to be able to find a way to catch Ohio back up in terms of work and increase our wages.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. Please, Carter just put a link in the chat. You can share feedback. Please do send us questions, comments, ideas for future webinars. Next month, I have space open if anyone on this call is interested in talking to the group, but I'm also looking at a couple different national speakers. So I can't tell you what the topic is going to be in October, but we will be back in October, and certainly appreciate all of you joining us today. And Dr. Pruitt, thank you for your time. Looking forward to the follow-up and learning even more about this report.
Yes, thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for attending.